What happens when a CEO orders a meal at his own fast food chain and hears something that stops him cold? Ethan Graves, founder and CEO of Blaze Burger, but lately, cracks had begun to show. Social media complaints about mistreatment, long wait times, and even discrimination were becoming too loud to ignore. His district supervisors downplayed the issues, insisting they were just one-off incidents. But Ethan wasn't convinced. Determined to uncover the truth, he shaved his beard, ditched the suit, and walked into one of his busiest locations, posing as just another hungry customer. Nobody in this company should ever feel invisible again. These words came from Ethan Graves, CEO of a major fast food chain, after he spent just 4 hours working undercover in one of his own restaurants. What he witnessed during his short visit was enough to completely overhaul his company's management structure overnight, where more than a few celluloid and customer screams against the screen. Ethan Graves rubbed his temples as he sat at the desk in his home office, scrolling through yet another page of customer reviews from the past month. The same themes kept resurfacing: complaints of rude employees, long wait times, and an overall sense that nobody seemed to care anymore. These reviews weren't just isolated gripes, they were repetitive, and they painted a picture of a business that had lost its. He stared at the words on his screen, feeling a knot form in his gut. Some complaints were polite but disappointed, others were blunt and scathing. It was the kind of feedback no CEO ever wanted to read, especially one who had poured so much into building a company from the ground up. Ethan had always believed Blaze Burger was different. When he opened his first store 15 years ago, he'd worked behind the counter himself. He made sure every order was accurate, every customer left with a smile, and every new hire felt like part of a family. That's the culture he wanted to instill as the brand grew. But the Blaze Burger of today was different. Sitting behind a desk in a high-rise corporate office, Ethan realized just how far removed he had become from the pulse of the business. Months of declining customer satisfaction reports flashed into his memory, but he'd convinced himself the data didn't reveal anything serious. A temporary staffing shortage, a bad manager who's being dealt with, somehow seemed less convincing now. The hands-off approach Ethan adopted over the years might have made sense at the time. Every leadership book he'd read stressed the importance of delegation. He let his managers take control of the day-to-day, while he focused on big-picture strategies like expansion and partnerships. It had worked well, or so he thought. But as Blaze Burger grew, stretching across dozens of locations, a natural distance formed between him and the stores where the burgers were flipped. The registers counted and the customers greeted. Some of his employees had worked for him for years and had still never met him in person. What snapped Ethan to attention were the numbers. Staring at the internal surveys and customer feedback consolidated in neatly designed corporate reports, one thing stood out. Satisfaction scores were steadily dropping and no one seemed to have a good answer for why. The last quarter alone showed a 6-point dip, with complaints targeting everything from food quality to staff attitude. One complaint stood out more than the rest: the worst service I've ever experienced. If your employees hate being here, what does that say about the company? I won't be back. Ethan leaned back in his chair, frustrated. Suddenly, the reports didn't seem to hold the answers he thought they did. They were just numbers on a page, and those numbers didn't capture the reality of what was happening in his stores. He began to piece it together. For every upset customer writing a scathing review on Yelp, there had to be employees behind the scenes juggling broken processes, low morale, or worse, a toxic environment out of view of his board. With each line he read, the sense of unease in his chest deepened. Why was he learning about these problems third-hand? Reports could only tell part of the story. There was only one way to understand what was really going on. Ethan pulled out an old spiral notebook, flipped to a blank page and wrote down a simple question. What's it like for the employees? He realized he'd been so focused on growth, so consumed by ensuring the next quarterly targets were met, that he hadn't stopped to ask something as basic as that. The answers to those employee experiences might hold the key to solving the complaints that were eroding customer loyalty. The decision came quickly after that. Ethan scribbled down a plan. If his position at the top of the chain meant he wasn't seeing the full picture, then he would see it for himself, directly, without all the buffers of reports and middle management. It wasn't about sitting in on carefully polished regional presentations or dropping by a store with corporate staff in tow. No, what Ethan needed was raw, unscripted truth. He needed the employees at Blaze Burger to see him not as the CEO with big promises, but as one of them, if only for a day. Going undercover wasn't something Ethan had ever imagined himself doing, but the idea made more and more sense the longer he sat with it. He grabbed his phone and texted his assistant, instructing her to clear his schedule for the following Friday. Next, he worked out the details. He'd visit a location that had been flagged repeatedly in the corporate reports for poor customer service and employee turnover. It was one of his busier stores, located in a suburban strip mall. If the problems were as bad as the complaints suggested, this would be the place to find them. His plan was simple. He'd blend in as an entry-level worker, skip the formal introductions and name tags that would tip people off to who he really was. A new hire, maybe, or a visiting trainee. Most of the frontline staff wouldn't recognize him. The chances of being discovered were slim. Instead of watching the store as a CEO, he'd see it with fresh eyes and observe the reality of day-to-day operations from the ground level. He didn't expect it to be easy. After all, he was putting himself in a world he hadn't worked in directly for over a decade. But discomfort didn't matter. What mattered was uncovering the truth. Sitting in his office with a determined expression, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years: curiosity. He wanted to know why these problems had been allowed to fester and how deeply they ran. But there was something else there, too, a creeping sense of unease. In preparation, he reread some of the worst reviews, imagining the scenarios they described coming to life in vivid detail. A worker rolling their eyes at a customer's question, a manager snapping at an overwhelmed employee, people at their wits' end, customers and staff alike. It was one thing to imagine it and another to witness it firsthand. Researchers have noted that as businesses scale, leaders often lose direct contact with the people who define their brand, especially in industries like fast food where high turnover and high stress are baked into the system. Ethan knew this distance was one of his blind spots. He had let his disconnect grow unchecked, but that was about to change. By the end of the evening, Ethan had finalized his plan, committing himself to whatever he might uncover behind the counter of that suburban Blaze Burger. From what he'd read, the problem sounded bad, but just how bad, that answer could only come once he stepped inside. And Friday couldn't come soon enough. Ethan stepped inside the Blaze Burger, and the sight that greeted him was enough to confirm his worst fears. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold, uneven glow over the restaurant. Counters were cluttered with greasy napkins and half-empty ketchup bottles. The trash bins were overflowing, and the air smelled of burnt oil. Behind the counter, a stressed-looking boy in his late teens juggled trays of food while Maria, the cashier, worked the register. From the moment Ethan walked in, he could sense the tension in the room. Something felt off. Ethan adjusted his baseball cap and wandered closer to the counter, pretending to scan the menu. Even with the noise of the kitchen, Carl's voice was impossible to miss. The manager stood near the back, barking words that cut through the air like a whip. "Hurry it up! You're slower than a sloth in winter," he yelled. The cook didn't respond, he just kept his head down and moved faster. Carl turned his attention to Maria next. "And you," he snapped, pointing at her, "stop chatting with the customers and do your job." Maria didn't look up. She muttered a quick "yes, sir," and went back to punching buttons on the register, her fingers trembling slightly. Her tired eyes darted between the growing line of customers and the piles of receipts stacking up beside the register. Ethan watched as she greeted the next person, muttering something under his breath before placing his order. Ethan couldn't blame Maria. Her body language screamed exhaustion. Carl, though, didn't seem to notice or care. "What's taking so long with the drinks?" he snapped, motioning toward a row of empty cups on the counter. "Are you waiting for them to pour themselves?" His words seemed designed to shame rather than solve the problem. Maria hurried to correct the issue, but fumbled with the soda machine. The sight of her cheeks flushing red as she spilled a drink was enough to make Ethan's stomach tighten. "Unbelievable," Carl shouted, loud enough for the dining area to hear. "Do you even pay attention to what you're doing?" Ethan felt his blood pressure rise. The scene unfolding in front of him was worse than he'd imagined. His reports, those impersonal charts and graphs, had alluded to issues, but they hadn't captured this, the raw human element of it. He wasn't just seeing mistakes or inefficiencies, he was witnessing people's spirits being crushed in real time. Maria's expression, a careful mask of compliance, twisted something deeper in him. It wasn't just her, it was the cook who barely made eye contact, the cashier who didn't dare defend herself, and the way the rest of the employees moved around Carl as if hoping to stay out of his line of sight. With undeniable, the store didn't just look chaotic, it felt oppressive. The repetitive complaints about rude employees and slow service suddenly made sense. Of course, the staff didn't have the energy to smile or work efficiently under leadership like this. Carl's attitude was contagious, seeping into every corner of the restaurant. Ethan's frustration mixed with guilt. How many stores were dealing with this exact scenario without him even knowing? And how long had it been happening under his watch? Carl didn't stop. "Maria, I'm not going to tell you again. You're a lost cause," he said, throwing his hands up for dramatic effect. "If corporate didn't have this stupid policy about keeping diversity numbers up, I'd have replaced you months ago." His voice was bitter, sharp, and soaked in disdain. Even customers turned their heads at the comment. Maria, still flustered, didn't respond. She just grabbed another cup and began filling it. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan bit the inside of his cheek. He knew better than to react in the moment. But everything about this was wrong. Carl was humiliating his staff in public, fueling the exact problems Ethan's customer complaints had described. He couldn't look away from Maria, whose quiet exhaustion seemed to sum up the entire store's energy. How many employees just like her had left because they couldn't handle the pressure anymore? Carl wasn't just creating a bad atmosphere, he was driving away good workers and taking customer satisfaction down with him. Rooms to excuse. There was no room for excuses. Research shows that toxic leadership creates ripple effects across a workplace. Studies have repeatedly linked abusive managers to higher employee turnover, lower morale, and reduced productistics. Ethan now saw those statistics come to life in front of him. Carl's constant criticism and dismissive attitude created an environment where no one motivated to do more than the bare minimum. And that's assuming they weren't actively looking for other jobs. It wasn't just about Carl, though. This was systemic. How had someone like him risen to a management position in the first place? Ethan shifted his attention back to the customers. A woman near the counter muttered something about the wait. "Yeah, this is terrible," her teenage son replied quietly, while the assistants were already cold. Ethan caught snippets of a man at the next table talking to his wife. "Did you hear what that guy just said to her, that poor girl?" The whispers were small but telling. Even customers could sense the toxic undercurrent. As Ethan watched, patterns became clearer. Carl's outbursts weren't just about venting frustration. They had shaped every corner of this store. Maria wasn't the problem. She was doing her best to stay afloat in a situation that seemed designed to sink her. From the slowness of the orders to the lack of smiles at the counter, everything tied back to the way Carl ran the team, or more accurately, dismantled it. Blazeburger hadn't always been this way. Ethan knew what it took to build a team that worked together seamlessly. It wasn't rocket science, but it did require respect, encouragement, and accountability, none of which Carl seemed capable of providing. The longer Ethan stayed, the more obvious the connections became. If employees felt demoralized under leaders like Carl, they had no reason to care about the customers walking through the door. The complaints Ethan had read, The slow service, sloppy orders, rude interactions, all started here. It was never about whether Maria could work a register quickly enough. It was about the culture being reinforced day after day by bad leadership. Standing near the soda machine, Ethan looked around one more time, taking everything in. The employees' nervous glances at Carl, the way they avoided eye contact with customers, the growing line of frustrated diners. It spoke volumes. Fixing this wasn't going to be about coaching employees or improving workflow. It had to start at the top, with the people entrusted to lead, and as CEO, Ethan knew the accountability ultimately landed on his shoulder. As Carl berated another employee for forgetting to refuel the napkin dispenser, Ethan felt a pull he couldn't ignore. This wasn't something he could sit back and observe any longer. This had to end. Tomorrow he'd have a decision to face. But first, he needed to see exactly how deep these cracks ran and how many people were trapped beneath them. Maria stood behind the counter, her uniform crisp but undeniably a little worn around the edges, much like the woman herself. Ethan had noticed her almost immediately, a small figure moving quickly but methodically, her attention bouncing between the register, the soda machine, and the growing line of customers. While the other employees seemed almost frozen in the tense atmosphere, Maria pushed forward, wiping her hands on her apron between transactions, offering quick, polite greetings to every customer. Her tone stayed even, almost pleasant, though there was no mistaking the wariness in her voice. Ethan found it impossible not to focus on her. She worked twice as fast as anyone else in the room, yet her efforts barely seemed noticed by those around her. After each interaction with a customer, Maria turned her head slightly to glance toward Carl, as if gauging whether she was in his line of fire. Her posture was a point, efficient, but her shoulders carried a weight that was palpable even from a distance. Every now and then she murmured an apology to a waiting customer or pushed back her hair with a quick, frustrated motion before returning to the register. Despite the tension, Maria's work ethic was undeniable. Ethan watched as she seamlessly transitioned from ringing up orders to filling soda cups and even stepping out from behind the counter to wipe down a set of tables left cluttered from the lunch rush. No one asked her to do it. In fact, no one else seemed to notice. The other employees either huddled near the kitchen area or milled around aimlessly, exchanging whispers or scrolling through their phones when Carl wasn't looking. Maria, however, barely paused. She greeted each new task with the same quiet determination, whether it was picking up stray wrappers from the floor or calmly responding to a customer who complained their fries were cold. When that same customer muttered, "This place is a mess," Maria didn't flinch. Instead, she gave a quick nod, replaced the order with an apology, and moved on. The stress Maria absorbed without complaint seemed amplified by Carl's relentless criticism. Ethan watched her handle two customers simultaneously at the register, one placing an order and another asking for clarification on a receipt. When Carl appeared suddenly behind her, he hovered there, arms crossed tightly against his chest, tapping his falling behind. "Maria," he said, his falling behind noise of the store. "We lose one more customer today because of your speed. Guess who's staying late to clean up?" Maria glanced back at him briefly, barely meeting his eyes before focusing on finishing the transaction in front of her. "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Ethan noticed one of her coworkers, a younger employee leaning over the counter near the soda machine, glance toward Carl and then look away quickly, as if silently thanking the universe that the manager's focus wasn't on him. As Ethan continued watching Maria, it was clear that Carl's criticisms were not only unwarranted, they crossed the line into abusive. "Is that your idea of customer service?" Carl barked when Maria accidentally dropped a tray of burgers near the edge of the pickup counter. The sound of the tray clattering to the tile floor drew attention, and Maria crouched down in one swift motion to collect the food without a word. "Do you know how much food waste you've caused this week? You think it comes out of your paycheck?" Carl's tone grew louder, his annoyance spreading to the front of house staff as they stood stiffly, clearly unable or unwilling to intervene. Maria paused for just a moment too long as she scrambled to replace the dropped tray. Ethan saw her take a deep, shaky breath, the kind of breath you take when you can't decide whether to cry or hold it together, and she chose the latter. By the time the food was on the counter and the customer received an apology, Maria had slipped back behind the register, her focus sharp once again. Yet something about the way she blinked and adjusted her posture betrayed just how much strength it took to keep from folding under the weight of Carl's public humiliation. Although Maria never openly defied Carl, her actions spoke volumes to Ethan. While others either avoided his wrath or performed the bare minimum, Maria's quiet resilience stood out. It wasn't just that she worked hard, it was the care she put into each task, small as it seemed. She wiped down counters no one had used, organized cups and napkins as though someone was watching, even when no one was. There was no visible reward awaiting her for these extra efforts, but she did them anyway. Ethan felt himself wrestling with two powerful emotions as he observed Maria. One was anger, not just at Carl's atrocious behavior, but at himself for letting this environment exist in the first place. This wasn't just one bad manager, he knew. Somewhere along the way, Blaze Burger's culture had stopped valuing people like Maria. Maria's perseverance reminded him of what Blaze Burger was supposed to represent. People who genuinely cared, who gave their best in the face of adversity. She embodied the company that Ethan had once envisioned, even as the present environment seemed determined to crush that vision under its weight. In the world of business, studies show that frontline employees like Maria are often the heart of any operation, but are also the most overlooked. Research confirms what Ethan was now seeing firsthand. If leadership fails to recognize and invest in these employees, morale drops, output suffer, and customers don't feel valued. Maria was proof of this disconnect, a woman who clearly cared about her role, doing everything she could to keep up with a thankless, chaotic environment, yet was being driven to the point of breaking without proper support. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about how different Blaze Burger could be if people like Maria were given the respect and resources they deserved. The contrast between her interactions with customers and Carl's behavior was jarring. She apologized when she didn't have to, patiently responded to rude comments, and even managed to crack a polite thank you here and there. Everything about her, from the way she kept her head down under Carl's insults to the efficiency with which she juggled her tasks, hinted at someone much stronger than her current position. Resistance. As Ethan watched Maria's steady work in the face of adversity, a thought began to take shape in his mind. What if Maria was more than just a good employee? What if she was the kind of person Blaze Burger needed in leadership? Ethan started noting the way she organized the chaos whenever Carl wasn't directly involved. She quietly stepped in when other employees missed something, ensured waiting customers were acknowledged, and adjusted to problems as they arose, all without causing additional drama. She had the instincts of a leader, even if no one else seemed to notice. By the end of the shift, Ethan had made a silent promise to himself. Maria's contributions, her dedication, her resilience, they couldn't go unrecognized any longer. He didn't just want to fix what was broken for her. He wanted to make sure she had a future at Blaze Burger where her potential could transform not just this one store but others too. She was the kind of person who could inspire others, someone who deserved to lead, not to be pushed aside by people like Carl. Ethan knew what he had to do, and as Carl's voice rose once more across the restaurant, the fuse was already lit. Ethan stood near the counter, pretending to fiddle with a condiment packet while his attention stayed locked on Carl. The manager's raised voice cut through the din of the store once again, this time louder, more biting than before. It started with a simple mistake. Maria had handed a customer the wrong receipt. An error so small it might have gone unnoticed in any other place. But not here, not under Carl's gaze. Unacceptable, Maria, Carl barked from across the counter. Customers turned their heads, their conversations fading into silence as his voice grew sharper. He marched up to Maria, throwing his arm out toward the cash register. How hard is it? You punch the buttons, hand the right receipt, and move on. Even a kid could do it, yet here we are." Maria stayed silent, her knuckles white as they gripped the edge of the register. Ethan noticed the faintest tremble in her hands as she muttered, "I'll fix it, sir," but Carl wasn't letting it go. "Fix it faster," he snarled, "and maybe figure out how to do your job the first time around. God knows it's not like you're overworked." The words hit the air like a slap, and the discomfort in the room became almost tangible. Ethan looked around, catching expressions of unease on the faces of the customers waiting in line. A middle-aged man shifted awkwardly, taking a half-step back as though he wanted to leave but couldn't quite bring himself to abandon his food. A young woman with a toddler glanced sideways at Carl, her eyes narrowing in disapproval, yet she said nothing. Everyone was watching, but nobody was doing a thing to stop it. Ethan's fingers tightened around the packet in his hand. He knew he couldn't let this go, but the debate raged inside him. Should he step in now, as just another anonymous customer, or wait? Revealing himself meant the entire dynamic would shift, blowing his cover and likely derailing everything he'd planned to accomplish by observing things firsthand. But how much more could he stomach? The breaking point came seconds later. Carl let out an exaggerated sigh and turned to face the rest of the staff, raising his voice just enough to ensure everyone in the store, employees and customers alike, could hear. "This is what I'm dealing with," he said, gesturing toward Maria with both hands like she was some kind of exhibit. "I've got employees here who can't handle the basics, and corporate expects me to make miracles happen. Well, guess what? Miracles don't happen when you're working with this level of incompetence." Maria stared down at the register, her lips pressed tightly together. It was the first time Ethan had seen her truly motionless since he arrived. Even the rhythm of her breathing seemed to slow. Ethan felt something inside him snap. His hesitation dissipated in an instant. It was time. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, placing himself directly between Carl and the counter. He didn't raise his voice, but his words hit with force nonetheless. "That's enough," he said, his tone steady and unmistakably firm. Carl blinked, momentarily startled at the interruption. "You don't get to talk to her or anyone like that." Carl turned toward him fully, clearly gearing up for a confrontation. "Who the hell are you to tell me how to run my store?" he demanded, his voice dripping with irritation. The other employees froze, their heads turning toward the two like spectators waiting for a fight to break out. Maria glanced up as well, confusion flickering across her face. Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly but keeping his words pointed. "Who I am doesn't matter," he said slowly. "What matters is the way you've been treating her. That's the problem." Carl's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might push back further. But something about Ethan's presence threw him off balance. Maybe it was the way he stood, unflinching and calm, while behind his eyes was a steel resolve that left no room for uncertainty. Slowly, Carl took a half step back, his composure faltering ever so slightly. "I don't need some random guy lecturing me about how to manage my team," Carl shot back after a beat, though his voice wavered. "I've got this under control." Ethan didn't wait for him to finish. "Under control," he said, his voice sharp now. "You're driving this team into the ground. And this isn't management, it's abuse." The room felt suddenly still. The sound of the grill in the back and the faint hum of the soda machine were the only noises breaking the silence. Carl frowned, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to form a coherent argument, but couldn't find the words. Confusion swept across his face as Ethan took a step back and let the other shoe drop. "My name's Ethan Graves," he announced, his voice cutting cleanly through the air. "I'm the founder and CEO of Blaze Burger, and this ends now." There was a beat of stunned silence, the kind that stretched just long enough for the gravity of his words to sink in. Carl froze where he stood, his face pale, while the rest of the staff exchanged wide-eyed glances. A younger employee near the fry station whispered, "What?" under his breath, clearly unsure if he'd heard right. "You're fired," Ethan continued, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Pack your things and go. You're done here." Carl blinked rapidly, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief and then back again. "You can't, and I already have," Ethan said simply. "Take the hint." Carl slumped back slightly, glancing around the room for support, but no one spoke. His feet seemed rooted to the spot for a moment before he finally turned, moving toward the back office in a daze. The employees watched him retreat, their faces a mix of relief and amazement. One woman who'd been in line clapped softly, the sound breaking the tension like a stone dropped in. A few of the other customers joined in hesitantly, and before long a light scattering of applause filled the room. Ethan turned toward the staff, his gaze softening as he addressed them. "I know this has been a rough place to work," he said, "but that changes today. I'm here to make sure it does." For the first time, Maria raised her head fully and looked at him. Her eyes brimmed with emotion, tears threatening to spill over as she nodded once, a kind of silent thank you. Ethan felt his chest tighten seeing her expression, a mix of relief, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite place. Something like hope. The team stood quietly as Carl stormed out the back with a box of his belongings, his exit underscoring the magnitude of the moment. Ethan could see the edges of change beginning to form, small, hesitant, but entirely real. What came next wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a while he felt certain that things were moving in the right direction. As the last echoes of applause faded, Ethan glanced around the space, already planning what needed to come next. It wasn't just about firing Carl or even fixing this one store, it was about rebuilding everything, starting from here. Ethan Graves stood at the front of the room, the quiet hum of conversation dying down as dozens of managers settled into their seats. This was the Leadership Summit, a yearly event that once focused on expansion plans, marketing strategies, and projections, but this time was different. Ethan looked across the room, waiting for full attention, and then began. "We've grown a lot over the years, but somewhere along the way, we stopped growing the right way that ends today." His voice was calm but deliberate, echoing across the space. "The problems I saw firsthand aren't isolated, they're systemic, and change starts here." He let his words sink in for a moment before continuing. "The days of ignoring problems or looking the other way are over," he added, his tone firm. "It's not enough to hit numbers or keep costs low if the people in our stores feel invisible. We're going to rebuild not just this company, but the way we lead." Ethan scanned the room, watching the subtle shift in expressions from curiosity to unease. The first initiative he unveiled emphasized accountability, mandatory leadership training for every manager in the company. This wasn't a suggestion or an optional workshop, it was a requirement. Managers would be trained to lead with empathy, to address conflict constructively, and to support their teams rather than control them. Ethan had seen enough toxic leadership to know it was the root of nearly every. The training wasn't just about fixing managers who were already a problem, it was about making sure no one like Carl ever rose to a position of power again. Ethan also introduced an anonymous feedback system that would allow employees to provide unfiltered input directly to corporate leadership. "I want every single employee to know that their voice matters," he explained. The system was designed to give staff a safe way to report problems or suggest improvements without fear of retaliation. Ethan believed this tool, if used correctly, could be one of the most powerful drivers of change in the company. Employees had told him, over and over, that their concerns often went unnoticed or dismissed outright. That was no longer acceptable. Every complaint would be logged, reviewed, and addressed. He outlined how this system would create a bridge between the front lines and corporate, giving employees an outlet that hadn't existed before. The third piece of the overhaul was an employee recognition program. For too long, hard work went unnoticed, leaving employees like Maria to feel as though their efforts were in vain. This new program was designed to change that. Outstanding performance, from simple gestures of kindness to consistent above-average output, would be acknowledged privately and publicly. Recognition wouldn't stop at a verbal thank you, it would come with tangible rewards. Ethan specified pay raises, bonuses, and opportunities for advancement as part of the program. If we want employees to go above and beyond, he said, we need to show them that we see their contributions and that they matter. Not everyone in the room was thrilled. As Ethan opened the floor for questions, a wave of resistance became apparent, particularly from veteran managers who had grown comfortable under the old system. One man in the back raised his hand and spoke up. "This all sounds great, but do you really think it's realistic? People complain, it's what they do. Does that mean I now have to answer to every bad mood my team has?" There were murmurs of agreement from a small group of managers nearby, and Ethan watched as others nodded hesitantly, reluctant to voice their own doubts but clearly willing to listen to them being aired. Ethan didn't flinch. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Change never was. "This isn't about catering to every minor complaint," he said, his voice steady. "It's about building trust. Employees who believe their concerns are taken seriously will be more engaged, more productive, and more likely to stick around when things get tough. If you're feeling threatened by this, maybe you should ask yourself why." The directness of his response sent a ripple through the room. Several attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Ethan didn't look away. He continued, "If we ignore this, we lose talent, we lose customers, and we lose everything we've built. Fixing this starts with every person in this room, myself included." Insistence persisted, particularly from store managers who felt the new expectations placed an unfair burden on their already demanding jobs. Ethan handled these objections methodically. He scheduled face-to-face meetings with the most resistant leaders, listening to their concerns while making it clear that the stakes were non-negotiable. His message didn't waver. This wasn't a temporary initiative, it was the future of the company. In the weeks that followed, the shift in culture began to take root. Maria, now promoted to shift supervisor, quickly became a living example of what good leadership could inspire. Ethan made a point to visit her store again. What he saw this time was unrecognizable compared to his undercover visit. The kitchen ran like clockwork, employees hustled without looking over their shoulders, and even during busy lunch hours the atmosphere felt calm. Maria exuded confidence, providing guidance to her team and stepping in whenever someone needed extra support. Her coworkers clearly respected her, approaching her with questions rather than avoiding interaction like they had with Carl. New customer reviews reflected the changes as well. Praises of friendly service and quick turnaround times began to replace complaints about rude staff. Maria's leadership had set a new standard and her team climbed to meet it. One cook, previously quiet and withdrawn, now worked the grill with an easy smile, cracking jokes with the cashier between orders. A young employee new to the team started shadowing Maria, soaking up her approach to solving problems without escalating stress. Athena's realized that the key to transforming Blaze Burger wasn't simply adding rules or systems, it was elevating people who embodied the company's values. Maria's transition from underappreciated cashier to a leader capable of turning an entire store around became the foundation for Ethan's vision. The employee satisfaction surveys confirmed what Ethan already suspected. Within 3 months of implementing the changes, satisfaction scores had jumped 30%, the highest increase in the company's history. Anonymous feedback was pouring in, and while not every comment was glowing, a clear theme emerged. Employees finally felt like people were listening. "I was skeptical, but I've seen real differences already," read one message. Another simply said, "For the first time, I don't hate coming to work." Ethan knew the data was just the beginning. Company culture couldn't be fixed overnight, but these were tangible signs of progress. More importantly, the shift wasn't just happening on paper. It was visible in stores like Maria's, where the energy among both employees and customers had completely shifted. The ripple effects were undeniable. Other managers began reaching out to Ethan, asking what they could do to empower their teams in the same way. The idea of leadership training, initially met with skepticism, now attracted managers who wanted to learn how to replicate Maria's success. The process hadn't been perfect, and Ethan knew challenges remained. Not every store was adjusting smoothly, and some managers continued clashing with the new expectations. But the proof was there. Transformation wasn't just possible, it was happening. It wasn't because people like Maria showed what was possible when employees felt respected and valued. Looking out across the continually changing landscape, Ethan realized this wasn't just about fixing Blazobergt. It was about redefining what leadership looked like, starting with himself. The lunch rush at Blaze Burger looked different now. Scenes of smiling employees handing over trays of food, clean counters stocked with neatly arranged condiments, and a steady stream of satisfied customers painted a picture unlike the ones Ethan had encountered just months earlier. At the heart of the change was Maria's store, whose turnaround had set the tone for the company's new direction. What began as a single experiment in correction firing Carl, promoting Maria, and overhauling toxic practices had sparked a change far beyond its four walls. Other stores were now following the same path, one at a time. Maria's promotion had been more than an individual success. It was symbolic of what Blaze Burger could be when employees were valued and empowered. In the weeks after taking over as shift supervisor, she had built a steady rhythm with her team. Her approach was simple: fairness, consistency, and patience. She worked alongside her staff, never asking them to do something she wouldn't do herself. During the evening shifts, she could be seen restocking supplies or stepping in to mop a spill, setting an example for her team. When new employees showed up nervous and unsure, she guided them step by step, balancing authority with encouragement. What she brought to the role wasn't just competence, it was trust. Her influence extended well beyond her own store. Word traveled quickly through the company about how Ethan's intervention had transformed one of the most troubled locations in the chain. District managers began looking closer at their own stores, questioning which of their teams had the potential to replicate Maria's progress. It wasn't an accident, after all, that results were emerging so clearly. Customer satisfaction scores at Maria's store had shot up by 42%, while employee turnover dropped to the lowest it had been in 5 years. Employees in other locations started to ask questions of their own. Why can't our store be like that? But while Maria's promotion and the visible success at her location served as a beacon of hope, scaling those results across 24 stores was never going to be simple. Ethan knew that what worked for one place wouldn't necessarily fit another. Individual stores faced unique challenges, while a high-traffic urban store dealt with space constraints and non-stop customer flow. Applying identical solutions everywhere would only create frustration. Each store had its own dynamics, its own history, and its own people. The first hurdle was resistance. Several stores had long-standing managers who had grown accustomed to operating however they wanted, focusing solely on meeting numbers and schedules. When Ethan's new programs began rolling out, mandatory leadership training, anonymous feedback, and employee recognition initiatives, some managers balked. "This is unnecessary," one regional manager argued during a "We just need people to do their jobs. If they don't like working here, there'll always be someone else who will." Others quietly agreed, feeling the pressure of expectations they weren't sure they could meet. Ethan addressed the skepticism head-on. He visited stores personally, holding small meetings with managers in break rooms or after hours when the last customers had left. Each visit followed the same structure. He listened first. Managers laid out their complaints or voiced their doubts, some questioning the practicality of implementing more empathetic practices. Some spoke bluntly, expressing frustration with the added workload they now faced. Ethan took it all in, but he never wavered from his message. "These changes aren't just good for employees, they're good for business," he told them. "We don't succeed as a company unless the people working here feel respected. The numbers will follow." Slowly, the growing resistance began to soften. A store on the outskirts of the city, known for its rocky management and consistently low-performing staff, became an early test case. Ethan worked closely with the store's manager, holding weekly progress calls to troubleshoot specific problems. He coached the manager through new principles of leadership, identifying strengths among his team, rewarding effort over perfection, and addressing calmly. For weeks it seemed like nothing would stick. Then, seemingly overnight, something shifted. Staff at the store began expressing more interest in their roles. A team member who regularly clocked out mentally after 2 hours showed up early one morning to help train a new hire. Complaints that had once consumed the store's feedback system dropped significantly. By the end of the quarter, the store broke into the company's top 5 in both efficiency and customer satisfaction metrics. Not every location adjusted so easily. Some struggled to break free of ingrained habits, particularly where management turnover was already high. But even here, progress made its way in. Anonymous feedback poured into the new corporate system, while these insights allowed Ethan's team to tailor solutions more effectively, rather than applying blanket fixes. Managers who had previously ignored or downplayed employee gripes now began paying closer attention, not because they were forced to, but because the results had become too obvious to deny. True it all, Ethan's presence played an undeniable role. His reputation within the company underwent a quiet shift, from the distant executive unreachable by frontline staff to someone willing to step into the trenches and learn. He showed up unexpectedly at random stores, sometimes just for an hour, to observe, ask questions, and quietly check on progress. He refused to let his visits become the type of staged events managers often scrambled to prepare for. He wanted raw honesty. This approach wasn't just about accountability, like the guide at the gateway. Employees knew they had an advocate, and that mattered. Maria's story had reminded them that authenticity wasn't impossible at Blaze Burger, and Ethan proved it by continuing to show up. Maria, now one of the most respected shift supervisors in the company, began taking on a larger role. Beyond running her own store, she participated in training sessions for new hires and spoke at regional meetings. She admitted she'd been terrified in the first days after her promotion. "I didn't think I could do it," she openly told a crowd of employees in one training session. "I remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to feel like you didn't matter to anyone, and I decided I'd never let that happen to anyone on my team." Her honesty resonated. She was proof of what was possible. A frontline worker, once overlooked, now shaping the company's future. The ripple effects were no longer theoretical. Other employees began asking for leadership roles, inspired by the possibility of moving up. Team dynamics at stores known for high turnover grew stronger as new systems ensured employees felt supported. Employee recognition programs brought visible results as awards and bonuses motivated staff to push beyond the expectations they once resented. Behind all of this was a growing foundation of research that Ethan had come to respect. Studies showed that empathetic leadership was no longer just a soft skill, it was a measurable advantage. Data consistently tied supportive workplaces to higher retention, increased productivity, and fewer customer complaints. Ethan's own experience confirmed this every time he walked into a store transformed by the implementation of these principles. By the end of the year, Blaze Burger looked like a company reborn. Ethan's vision, a company where no one feels invisible, was no longer just a hopeful idea. It was taking root in every corner of the business, driven by leaders like Maria and reinforced by the systems Ethan had worked tirelessly to implement. Some challenges remained, but the trajectory was impossible to ignore. Looking beyond Blaze Burger, Ethan began to recognize the broader implications of what they had achieved. The fast food industry, notorious for its high-stress environments and relentless focus on profits, rarely highlighted stories of transformation driven by care for people. What if that changed? What if this model wasn't just the exception but the future of the business? Ethan didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. What they had built wasn't just better for the employee. It was better. Ethan Graves had once believed leadership meant strategy and delegation, but his journey proved otherwise. True leadership wasn't about sitting at the top. It was about showing up, listening, and taking action to uplift those who shouldered the hardest work. His decision to go undercover revealed harsh truths, but it also uncovered immense potential in people like Maria. By addressing toxic practices and promoting empathy, Ethan showed that transformation begins with humility and accountability. What would happen if leaders everywhere paused to truly see their employees? Ethan's story is proof that change doesn't come from reports. It starts with presence and purpose. And promoting empathy, Ethan showed that transformation begins with humility and accountability. What would happen if leaders everywhere paused to truly see their employees? Ethan's story is proof that change doesn't come from reports. It starts with presence and purpose.